We're back. It's time for the double shot. John Pollock, Wai Ting. Tonight we are chatting about Abdullah the Butcher, Legacy of Blood.
Hmm.
A lot of blood in this episode.
Uh, is it called Legacy of Blood? Wow, what a cool name.
Yeah, that's
Effective.
what they went with. So this was an episode that I think everyone was kind of curious to see how they would cover this episode. Abdullah the Butcher, he is like legitimately like one of the biggest foreign stars in the history of Japan. He's one of the larger stars of you know decades in professional wrestling, and one of the rare instances of someone who had a huge career without ever working in the World Wrestling Federation, but had in Japan, in Puerto Rico, and throughout the US. He was a massive name in Montreal. And I think that aspect, in terms of if you were coming into this with a career retrospective, that's not what this was going to be. And they had to essentially jump into, you know, highlights of certain things. And like, did you feel that got across, Way? Like, were you, I would have loved to have seen more of like the Japanese stuff. But again, we're running into the time that they have, and they were going to spend the majority of it all on the Devin Nicholson stuff that became pretty much the second half of this episode.
Yeah, you're suggesting whether or not his stature and his career came across like properly in the first half of this. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah. Did you feel that it was, do you feel they got across the size of career this guy had? It was, I thought they did a good job of positioning him as this, like, if you have never seen Abdullah the Butcher, of getting him across as this maniacal heel that was, frightening to an audience, and drew very well.
I would say the answer is yes. Just simply, I think, through having somebody like a Mick Foley speak about his influence, showing his career in Japan and being like an animated character, like the influence I think was pretty evident. I get the sense, John, like, maybe we're about to talk about, and I think a lot of the small amounts of feedback I've seen coming out of the show was maybe criticism of how much they should have covered the Devin Nicholson story. Um, and
In what sense? I haven't sought out any feedback. What
or
has been like the complaint?
I think maybe some people just feeling like giving Devin Nicholson a platform um turned a lot of people off.
Mm-hmm.
That's, again, I didn't see every single piece of feedback coming off of it. To that, I would say,
I don't think you can tell. I think there would be more of a criticism if you didn't bring that aspect up.
agreed. Yeah, agreed. I mean, this show is called The Dark Side of the Ring. It's not A&E biography. We are here to talk about the controversies and sort of like, the unpleasant sides attached to figures. And like it or
I
not,
wouldn't say Devin Nicholson came off as this sympathetic figure either. Like, they certainly put him into a position where I didn't think either guy came across too well in this episode between Abdullah and Devin Nicholson. I think we should start there and talk about some of the Devin Nicholson stuff, because it was so heavy on that aspect, as I said, for probably the second half of this. And for those that are unfamiliar, Devin Nicholson is a Canadian pro wrestler who also delved into amateur wrestling pretty significantly in the country as well. And as they positioned it here, was someone that got very close with Abdullah, and they worked a lot of matches together. And then in 2009, Devin Nicholson was going to get a developmental deal from WWE. And when they did the medical check on him, like that has happened to some other performers, he got flagged, and they found that he had hepatitis C. And when going back, he was also around the same time, there was a documentary team following him around, and they had footage of one of the matches with Abdullah, where Abdullah uses the blade on himself and then uses it on Devin Nicholson. So it's a dirty blade that he uses to cut open Abdullah, and
Devin Nicholson.
sorry, to cut open Devin Nicholson with. And he concludes that that's probably how it happened. And it led to a major lawsuit by Devin Nicholson, and he ultimately won the case and was awarded $2.3 million in damages. And they did have to test Abdullah's blood, and he did come back with like a rare form of hepatitis C.
The same rare form that Devin Nicholson.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's certainly backed up. Like, this is probably the cause of why you ended up with hepatitis C. And thus he didn't get his contract offer from WWE. And Devin Nicholson states that he's never received a penny from Abdullah, and, you know, harbors a ton of resentment against Abdullah. Now, Devin Nicholson is hardly this character that is going to elicit a great degree of sympathy from people, because he has been involved in a lot of situations where he's taken advantage of people in the ring. And I would say most famously is the incident from 2021 that they showed on this piece, where they point out like the irony of him taking liberties with this referee on a show in Texas, where he ends up stabbing this referee. And I mean, they showed
with a spike. So I guess the what he was supposed to do was just draw blood using this blunt object or whatever object it was, and it ended up like being much worse than what
it was. Terrible. And we talked about this when it happened. It was just a terrible, terrible incident. And I didn't think Devin Nicholson came off well in his defense of it on this. Like, his reasoning was that the communication wasn't good and they had no medical staff there. It's like, well, they shouldn't have needed medical staff, first of all, for a cooperative angle, right, where you ended up going way further than whatever was agreed upon. And they had clips here of like Lance Storm, just like, why is this guy not arrested for assault, essentially? So I think it was very important to have that aspect in it, because if they had not included that, I think this would have been quite the whitewashing of Devin Nicholson to not bring up that aspect. And, you know, there's a lot you can say about Devin Nicholson, but he is not someone that is going to be painted as a victim for most people.
And on the Abdullah side of things, we at least hear perhaps his defense in that basically he lost his trial because he never went to court, because he claims he never opened the letters because he
can't read or write, is what he stated. And earlier stating he dropped out of school in 2nd grade. And then this part's interesting because they go to Abdullah's contemporaries, and there was definitely a degree of skepticism among those that, I mean, Mick Foley was really struggling. Like, he did not want to, but he's like, I remember going to restaurants and he had no problem reading the menu. And you had Hugo Savinovich, who was
Foley was almost like trying to, you could tell the discomfort in Mick Foley and trying to,
he was very uncomfortable,
because he, like, on the one hand, okay, do I lie or do I potentially implicate my friend, you know, and former colleague here? And he almost tried to frame, like, he told his truth, and that's that this is news to me. He was surprised because he was on the road and Abdullah could read menus, and almost seemed to frame it as, if that's the case, well then he and Hugo, like, they both tried to frame it as like wow, this person overcame, you know, like, this sort of reading disability. And
Hugo was just
Hugo took it another step. Yeah,
if that's the case, then this 2nd grade teacher needs a medal for what they were able to do. That's incredible. That's just incredible. Like, let's all like not shy away from the backdrop here that, like, Abdullah the Butcher is famously like the hustler of all hustlers. And no one knows this more than the people that were closest to him. So when they're hearing this story, oh, he couldn't read or write, I think naturally there's a skepticism among these people that traveled on the road with him. And I think it makes it very hard for the viewer to have a level of sympathy for Abdullah here, when the people that were closest to him on the road, I mean, they saw this guy in action. And I mean, even one of the family members just mentioned his sister. He was always a husler, talking about him from a kid. And
sister did confirm, or sister did say that it's true he can't read or write.
She did. The family did. We should go over, like, beyond of the family members. They had his sister, his caregiver, and then his brother Ralph, who, how this guy didn't end up as his manager on the road is beyond me, because this dude was a character if there's ever been one. I mean, he was hyping up his brother, and just like, this guy had the gift of gab.
This guy's interviews were interesting because, like, it kind of seemed like, I don't know if he was exactly aware of like what Dark Side of the Ring was, nor like, I think the level of understanding of the professional wrestling business that, like, certainly the producers and definitely I would say the audience had. Like, he was almost speaking as if, like, did you know wrestling is fake? Like, that's real blood. Like, what was
That's
sort
the
of like
dark
the
side.
answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You would think the title would be enough of a tip off.
I mean, I get that not everybody would be watching Dark Side of the Ring, but he was a character. Yes, I'd agree with that.
So, I mean, how did you feel this portion was handled, and kind of the coverage of both Devin Nicholson and Abdullah the Butcher in these two instances?
So I think, if you're going to be presenting the story, I think what we'd expect from, at this point, what I consider to be very much a journalistic source in Dark Side of the Ring, is to present both sides of the story and to, let the audience really kind of make up their own minds. And I feel like they did the best they could with that. They presented Abdullah's argument. They first presented Devin Nicholson's argument, then they presented Abdullah's argument, and then they had other people close to them weigh in on it. They question, like by interviewing and asking people like Mick Foley and Hiko, is it true that he couldn't read? They're probing and they're trying to see if, like, this is bullshit or if this is reality.
Yeah.
In the end, we're not going to get a straight answer, of course.
No.
But it's up to the audience.
It's complicated, because I can certainly see people watching this that do not have time to hear Devin Nicholson's side. That said, he was absolutely wronged by what Abdullah did, and it's there with like video evidence.
This is also a gray area too, because what laws are there in place when it comes to bleeding in professional wrestling, using a razor blade to cut your own head, and allowing your opponent / colleague to cut you over the head? I mean, there are no laws for these things, John. To somebody who
that doesn't make it right. Like what Abdullah did. That's what I'm stating here. I'm not stating like this is a law that was like necessarily codified that he is breaking. But a court did find him to, in fact, be in the right.
I would suggest like most of what happens in a professional wrestling ring is probably pretty like foreign to like the Canadian court of law. And is there that mutual because Tony Atlas was in defense of Abdullah. Tony Atlas says, well, you know what you're signing up for. You let the guy cut you because you're afraid of doing it yourself. And
but did he agree that you're going to cut yourself first? And then, and what is your awareness of your hepatitis that you have?
That's another area.
Like that's
that
completely
makes
reckless. If you're Abdullah the Butcher that is bleeding in rings in every match, and you've got hepatitis, that is like, I don't know how you defend that.
Yeah. But why would you let somebody bleed on you to begin with for your profession is going to be my argument.
Okay, but then we have to bring that up every single time we see blood, because
I think anytime there's blood in professional wrestling, it should come with a blood test. John Moxley, I hope he's getting tested every single week, like the same way porn stars are. Because if you're going to spread fluid towards your partners and also like the audience and your colleagues, like you have to be responsible. And I have to hope that type of like precaution.
You think Jun Kasai is getting regular blood testing?
I hope so. I think this should be standard, don't you?
I think a lot of things should be standard in pro wrestling that are not.
Yeah, and that's wrong, and that deserves.
They don't
to
have
be called
healthcare.
Upon.
Like,
sure,
I think
that's all wrong. This is all to say, John. It's hard. I could see both sides. Is all I'm saying. I could see Devin Nicholson being pissed off that he got hepatitis B allegedly. We don't know, because Abdullah claims that he got it from Devin Nicholson. So we've never seen this in court, so it's never been proven either way. But I could see why he'd be pissed off, and I can also see why Tony Atlas would argue this guy knew what he was signing up for. It's a complicated matter, but yeah, maybe to some it's not that complicated.
Does this change your attitude towards blood at all? Because it's something that we always bring up. And I think it became a real topic of those that followed Nigel McGuinness. And that was his big plea in his documentary that he did. This was the non-WWE documentary that he did. And just stated like he was not going to participate in any rings that earlier matches in the night had blood, and was not going to risk that. And it's, I think, a perfectly logical question to have when we're not aware of any like protocols. And I mean, is it on the one side, is it an alarmist viewpoint when we see so much blood, and yet this Abdullah the Butcher, Devin Nicholson story, it's not like this is common. It's not like this happens to any degree of regularity. But on the other hand, like, it's like, can you guarantee that this couldn't be a problem that
Well, we know
someone
Devin
has?
Nicholson has hepatitis C, or has had, I guess, because he got it cured.
Yeah, he did go through some kind of experimental treatment and
Right.
apparently is
But we
negative for it now.
know he had it, and we know Nigel had it because they were both tested as a part of their WWE, entries. And the fact that they didn't know until that point suggests that it probably didn't exist in any other company until they got to the WWE. I don't know what sort of transparencies we've heard from other companies that have, taken on a similar approach. Obviously, if you're operating on an independent small scale, I think maybe you can understandably, the rules are a little bit more lax. Not to say that they should be, but I'm very curious that a company on the level of an AEW, who is trying to very much do things by the book and do things on a professional level. Well, what sort of blood testing sort of policies do they have?
If you were to poll a locker room, okay, say a locker room of 100 men and women, how many do you think would want to know?
If I'm wrestling and I'm being bled on by like somebody who could potentially like infect me, and then I can infect my loved ones, I would 100% want to know.
Okay, then there's others that I feel would they want that knowledge of something that could potentially end my career if the wrong result comes back. I think you would be surprised, Wai. I think there would be people that would not want to know, much like there are people that I think do not want to know trauma that they have sustained to their head and what might be what they might be dealing with, and would just rather not know.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but like, that's no excuse, that's just like, that's just pretending, that's just being ignorant.
I'm just stating it from a fact of this exists where, outside of any major company ordering you to, it would be completely voluntary for people to do this.
So very much on the topic of like the memo, this is more so about the responsibility of the people employing these people and putting on these products and allowing them to bleed on their product. It's up to them. And I would suggest that they probably want to know everything.
Yeah, and it does come down. It is very much a health concern because, at least as we can state with like AEW, it is clearly not a sponsor backlash that they have towards blood.
So it was evidence of that.
It's like, obviously there's not sponsored discomfort with it. So it comes down to you as a company feeling that it is necessary that you make sure you have healthy athletes and that you do not have a situation like this. Like, there is that responsibility that I feel should be mandatory. I would say, at the very least, you're having like yearly check-ins, and that goes for, your heart. Like, they discovered when MVP had that heart issue, like just a lot of these tests. The UFC fighter recently who just happened, he got booked at the last minute, went through his pre-scans for the fight, and they found this very rare brain disease that he had that's treatable, but you would have never found that out if not for a company the level of a UFC that's going to do this intensive testing for you and these screenings. And I think that should be something that, all of these performers should hopefully want to have, and that it shouldn't be something that's out of pocket that they have to do. And, the independent scene, unfortunately, it kind of is the Wild West, where you cannot expect independent promoters to take on that level of oversight with the way the medical system is.
Before we proceed, a point of correction here. This comes to us actually from David Bixon's fan. Bix, listening to us live here. Nigel had Hep B, not Hep C, and it was flagged by TNA, not the WWE. WWE allegedly flagged his shoulder issues. So,
yeah, that it was the shoulder issue that he came into, and that, he felt he could perform with, and then that was ultimately that led to him not getting his contract. That was 2009, and then he goes to TNA.
So I stand corrected. TNA evidently was doing some form of testing at that point too.
Yes.
How widely, spread is it among other major promotions that we talk about on a weekly basis? And, especially when I feel like blood use, through AEW feels as more prevalent and mainstream as it has ever been in professional wrestling in North America.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that, listen, you can have, like, I think a lot of people, they can look at blood as an enhancement to matches. And again, it's not as though we have this. I mean, you can look at this and this is a pretty bad outcome that you could have. but it has not been widespread. You had the issue with Bob Orton Jr. in WWF when he was working with
Alex in the chat says this
brought up as
discussion
well.
reminds me of Undertaker Bob Orton. Yes.
So I mean, at the same time, it's not like this is like a 1 in a million chance of happening. Like the odds are a lot lower than that. And certainly you want to see these performers have, their latitude of where they can go in certain matches, and there's a plethora of blood in many, many different companies. And you hope that it's done in as safe of a format as possible, but there's no guarantee that you're not, flirting with potential transmission, and just like that's a reality when you're incorporating blood and open wounds in a match and doing things in the nature that they are.
So maybe to get back to, Dark Side of the Ring, I would suggest that the fact that we're even having this conversation at this level, to me at least, told me that like I thought it did a good job of, presenting the issue and presenting equal sides of the issue to try to explain what could be done about this in the future, who is in the wrong, so that we could prevent something like this in the future.
Yeah, I feel there were a lot of different avenues this episode could go, from, and separate from the career retrospective on Abdullah. That's probably a performer that a lot of people don't know all the, just all the places that he did do very significant business. There's also the dark side theme to it of, yes, there was the Devin Nicholson chapter. There's also the fact that this guy made incredible money and is left penniless at the end of it. And he is in financial ruin and flat out states on this episode. And I'm sure that was part of his motivating. Like, this is someone that very much protected his character. And in an episode like this, I think his side of it was getting his story out there and looking for some kind of lifeline, because he is left with no money. And that part was not explored, about, his situation and where all of his money went. He blames it on not being educated, but it's another very sad story. Like, you have this guy, he just did an interview on Bradshaw and Jerry Briscoe's podcast, and he's saying it somewhat in jest, but I don't think it's completely a joke. The idea of him, once he gets a hip replacement, mind you, he's 82 years old, that he could wrestle another match or something like that. Like, it's insanity when you hear about this, but this is somebody that is, you pretty much got a picture of an individual that is destitute.
Yeah. And like the moment he gets any money in his checkbook or bank account, like how much of it has to go to this lawsuit or Devin Nicholson?
Well, it's one of the things about these suits. It's like the judgment. It's like, it's ultimately on you to collect. And it's been how many years since this judgment was read, and he hasn't paid a penny. I would not imagine Devin Nicholson is holding his breath that he's ever going to see any of this money.
Yeah, hard to get $2 million out of somebody with none.
Anyone else that stood out to you? I thought that like Hugo Savinovich was very interesting. You could definitely do multiple episodes, I think, on Puerto Rico itself. They have done the Brody episode,
which a lot of crazy shit happened.
There was, and of the footage that's out there, I mean, it's certainly like they wanted to get across like this man as this monster and the bloodbath that he was involved with, and they certainly had the footage to navigate and tell that story. And also, it was very, very small, but the impact he had in Japan, where he was a massive foreign star for All Japan, and crossing over very much like Bob Sapp did a generation later. But just the stuff they had here with the celebrity crossovers, an album that he cut that they had a sample of, commercials he appeared in, and all of this woven, like he always stayed in character.
Yeah. So recently, like, I had you guys, I had Braden, I had Davey and Mouth over, and a bunch of us in the backyard, and we just started playing like wrestlers' albums from Japan, and we were all listening to like the Terry Funk album, and I just love the idea that like, stardom in professional wrestling in Japan comes with a record deal, and that they're just handing albums out to anybody with a name.
Kamala was a great singer. James Harris.
I mean, it's amazing to me. Like here, we kind of feel, at least I feel like, recording an album is like something you have to like completely change your career for, and you got to put years and years into. It's just like, but like it's awesome. It's awesome that there's an Abdullah the Butcher album that I might be able to find on Spotify.
As we wind down here, when you think of like Abdullah the Butcher, I think certainly based on your age, you're gonna have different thoughts on him. But I mean, like the guy's 82 years old. It's like he is getting up there, and I'm just wondering how much of his, when his day comes, how much is he going to be remembered for the Devin Nicholson stuff, which both of them in this episode are sort of stating they neither wants to talk about this anymore. But for many people, it's going to be the most accessible information about Larry Shreve, Abdullah the Butcher, and I do feel like it's like my point was, if you had done a whole 44-minute episode on Abdullah the Butcher and did not touch on the Devin Nicholson stuff, I think it's a major gap that of the last 10 years has been a very significant part. And Hugo Savinovich even bringing up like all the guys he bled with. I mean, and Hugo being around him so much, like I'm sure.
And he said he's tested negative, and as far as we know, others have as well.
So right. I guess it's just a roundabout way of asking sort of the Abdullah the Butcher legacy. I think it's certainly one that it can be many different directions, but this one, the Devin Nicholson stuff, it's going to be a prominent portion of it.
Well, yeah, like considering that, I think at this point, maybe like some of the highlights of his professional wrestling career have kind of been like
outside of WWE too. So it's not like you have like of that generation of fans that were not spoon-fed sort of who are the legends of this business that get that DVD treatment. I mean, he went into their Hall of Fame, but he's not one of the celebrated WWE figures that are sort of going to give the more in-depth glossy story.
That footage is not replayed the way a Hulk Hogan or even like, I don't know, Iron Sheik, their careers might be throughout present day professional wrestling. And I think even a lot of the contemporaries that are that he wrestled are either not around, or even people that he was influenced by aren't necessarily like speaking about him in the same way. Which is why I think like having Mick Foley on this episode was so interesting. And John Moxley with using the fork tonight, I also do wonder if there's like a direct connection to this episode airing this week. But I would say, like, as far as his legacy goes, I predict it would be very much like the content of this particular documentary, John. Whenever the time comes, I imagine you would get a very similar like overview of his entire life, coupled with maybe a good chunk on that, on the Devin Nicholson stuff.
Yeah. My last thought on this episode is that, like, overall, like, I felt that they dedicated a lot of time to the whole blood issue and Devin Nicholson. I did feel like, especially that portion, it was lacking that that sort of voice of a neutral party, like a reporter, somebody covering it that I think could have added a whole lot more to it. Someone like a Greg Oliver, a Brian Solomon, who wrote the book on the Sheik, and I think has like a really good understanding of Abdullah's career and the present. And rather than a Mick Foley, who, all due respect to Mick Foley, it just felt like he felt uncomfortable talking about this stuff. And I just feel like he was a friend. He was a friend, but also someone that I think is like, it was kind of similar as like, yeah, it's like Mick Foley's been on a lot of these episodes, and it feels like they just bulked a lot of these topics around Mick Foley. And on the surface, you think of Abdullah the Butcher and Chamber of Horrors comes to mind. And yeah, Mick Foley would be great to talk about that. And he's someone that like idolized Abdullah the Butcher. Like there's a place for that. But I think in that specific chapter, I would have liked, somebody that was like on the ground covering this case and understands who these individuals are and can kind of cut through the wrestling bullshit and get to the real matter.
So I'm assuming like, are you surprised Dave didn't make an appearance in this, considering he was interviewed for the series?
Yeah, I mean, he could have been one as well. Just somebody that can get through. Like, inevitably, when you're talking about Abdullah and Devin, it's like these guys are characters, and even in this situation, like you want to have someone that can at least navigate through that portion of it, and it's not just a back and forth he said and the facts of the case that you can just have from sort of a neutral observer. I think when Darkseid gets into these types of like legal matters and such, I think it really helps when they have that kind of interview subject,
which might be kind of hard to come by, when you're asking somebody to weigh in on, like, you just want the straight facts, like this is what Yeah, I mean,
Greg Oliver
I
would
don't
have been
know.
my pick. He wrote like a very good review of this episode on the Slam site. Like he would have been one, and it's Toronto based too, where they do a lot of this shooting.
Well, obviously not to spoil the Greg's review, which people should go check out. But what were sort of some of his overall thoughts? Did he?
I mean, just
believe
the
this was
fact that
fair?
it was an incomplete documentary and just
In what
elements
sense?
more so the wide like the big jumps in his career, which again it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. If they spent so much time on his career, you'd fill up those 44 minutes. And if the Devin Nicholson stuff got 5 minutes, it would have been much worse. And people would have been up in arms about, stuff that was left out. So I think everyone's understanding of like, especially a character that you could clearly do a whole lot more on an Abdullah the Butcher.
The show is called Dark Side of the Ring. If anything, the whole first half of it, talking about his legacy, was just to set up the final portion to tell you why this is the story we care about.
But he also had critiques of the handling of the Devin Nicholson and Abdullah stuff. But I think a lot of people that were maybe turned off by Devin Nicholson, especially the clip off the top where they're kind of just showing the clip of him, hoping Abdullah has a miserable death or something like that. That felt very sensational at the start of it. And I think the fact that they did balance it out by including the Texas incident, I think that had that been omitted, I think you would have had, a rightful cause for people to be upset with that chapter.
Yeah, I think even without it, like he comes across like to some people like a guy, like picking on a broke, 80-something-year-old. But again, it also depends where you might stand on I don't know, feeling sympathy for him in that particular issue of him getting bladed. For me, like my takeaway is just like I think this provides like a good reason to look closer at the role of blood in professional wrestling. I think it belongs in professional wrestling, but I also think it should be used as safely as possible with every precaution taken, especially if you're operating at the most professional level, like a WWE or AEW is. In WWE, they're outright banning it, and I don't blame them for it one bit. AEW is choosing to embrace it. Now, what steps are they taking to make sure that it's being used responsibly?
Why don't you just come out and say it, that it's a further testament to the safety that was incorporated by Yoshihiko and Speedball Mike Bailey by using packets of ketchup in the absence of real blood.
I think that's the future. Really, we should all be advancing the ketchup at some point.
Okay. So there you have it. That is the episode. Next week is Bam Bam Bigelow. So they've juggled the schedule up. This Bash at the Beach episode keeps getting pushed back. So next week it's Bam Bam Bigelow, then Bash at the Beach, and they conclude with Marty Jannetty.
That we think. They might,
that we
they might
think.
push
I mean, this Bash at the Beach, maybe at this point it's going to be the season finale. I don't know what holding up Bash at the Beach, which is I don't know.
Like, could be editing too. Like we know
I'm sure it is edit. Like we've heard from Evan before, where it's like, man, we've only edited X amount of the episodes and we're already on the air. I'm sure there's stuff they run into. I wouldn't think it's like subject matter as much as it probably is just the editing process, or who knows, it could be a laundry list of issues, but that'll be an interesting one to see. And I'm hoping that one is not as heavy as some of these subjects have been, but who knows what they'll uncover from Bash at the Beach 2000. If it is Russo and Bischoff screaming at each other for 2 hours or for an hour, I don't know if I'll make it through.
I can see why the editing would take so long then.
Well, we will more to look forward to. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in for the doubleheader tonight,
and thank you for the people who have left feedback over the past week about these Dark Side of the Ring discussions. A lot of people are watching, or at least care about us talking about them. So we'll keep doing them throughout the rest of the season.
That is right. So we have 3 more episodes to go. Wai and I will be dropping Rewind-A-Wai on Thursday here on the cafe, looking at AWA Super Clash 1985 with a bit of blood on that episode. 3.5 hours at Comiskey Parkway.
I'm trying not to think about it, John.
Oh, it probably took you so long to watch. You must be so happy that you can go to bed after this and chat about Comiskey Park.
It should be a fun review tomorrow. The POST Wrestling Café, you guys will find it in your boxes sometime Thursday evening.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.